Thank you, thank you. So I just want to start right off the gate with a pop quiz. What year is this from? Shout them out. Last year. 80? Good. Closer. We're going to play game show rules. You got to be under but not over.
96.
92? All right. Fair enough. Anybody further back? No? All right. Here's the answer. It's from 1910. It's actually one of the first org charts to use boxes and lines. It's from an old Southern Pacific Railroad in the U.S. And this is 109 years old. And what I find fascinating about that is when I show this, I usually get guesses ranging from about 1850 to yesterday or even tomorrow. This is next month's org chart release. And what I find fascinating about that is if I'd shown you a picture of literally anything else, a shoe, a house, a car, a dress, a phone, you would have been able to carbon date it better. But when I show you the main instrument by which we visualize all of human labor, you're kind of like, there's a century of range on when that thing was invented, right? And so, one of two things is true. Either it's perfect and we can all go back to work and just cut it short today, or there's something about it that's quite intractable and quite hard to change, right? And so we have to just sit with that for a second. So that's the first pop quiz. There are two more. The second one is to look at these ways of working, right? So these are ways of working that I've collected from a mysterious source, insisting on doing everything through channels, not taking shortcuts to expedite decisions, when possible referring matters to committee for further study and having those committees be as large as possible, haggling over the precise wordings of emails and missives to customers and to our fellow employees when we make changes, etc. Referring back to matters decided upon at the last meeting, right? Maybe in a private one-on-one or over coffee or around the water cooler or in an email or a Slack message saying, hey, I think we should make a decision differently than what happened in the room. And then my personal favorite as someone that works with large companies, multiplying the procedures and clearances involved in issuing instructions and paying checks and so on. See that 3 people have to approve everything where 1 might be enough, right? So show of hands, who's ever seen these behaviors in the workplace here or elsewhere in the past, maybe? Has a spouse who's dealing with this? Yeah. Does anyone know what these are from? It's kind of a funny story. So most people guess that they're from clients that I've observed and worked with. But I didn't come up with these, actually. These were invented. They were invented in the 40s at the height of World War II, when the precursor to the CIA was trying to figure out how to sabotage enemy businesses. And the idea was that people that were Confederate to us, that were on our side but inside enemy businesses, would use these approaches to slow those businesses down and grind them to a halt. So that was the idea, and it's actually, there's quite a long list. There's about 14 or 15 things. I chose my 5 favorites, but there are many, many more in there. And so what has effectively happened is in the space of 80 years, we've gone from this being obviously nonsensical to sabotage being indistinguishable from work. That effectively most people in the modern economy are working in an environment where we're actively sabotaging ourselves with the way of working, at least in terms of how people might have thought, 60, 70, 80 years prior, right? And what's interesting is that in the midst of that, the things that have maybe served us well in the past are starting to fail us. So we're all, of course, aware of, assembly lines and the factory model of working and having, hierarchies of managers and thinkers and doers separated and all that. But somewhere along the lines, that has started to fail, and it's really not something that we talk about much. So if we look at indicators like the average lifespan of a company, down and to the right over time, right? Used to be a dynastic 60-year run that you would have on a big index like the S&P 500 if you were a big successful company. Now it's closer to 10 years. Every 2.5 weeks a company falls off that list from either dying and sort of pulling a Kodak or getting dealt with in M&A. Return on assets, which is a much better indicator of business health than, say, its stock performance. The stock can be manipulated a little bit, but the ROA is just how much profit can we generate with what we own. Very hard to manipulate, and that's gone in the same time period from close to 5% to down to nearly 1%, and it's on its way down, which essentially means we can't make more profit with more stuff. When we get bigger, when we get more global, when we get more interconnected, suddenly we become immobilized. And we're seeing the same thing happen with productivity growth. So if you track productivity growth over the last century, it has gone down and down and down to the point where we're not getting any more gains, right? We're inventing all this incredible stuff. The people in this room and in this company are inventing things that you would think, oh my gosh, the device in my pocket has more power than the computers that took us to the moon. And yet productivity, we're not being able to make more per hour than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's really sort of grinding to a halt. And when you ask economists why this is happening, they scratch their heads. They're kind of like, we're really not sure, or they debate about it. What's interesting is when you then ask people what's going on, they say that they're not super psyched about work. So 1 in 2 people is kind of thinking about quitting, thinking about maybe how they're unhappy in their current job, they're disengaged, they're working for the weekend. About 1 in 5 or 6 people is actively sabotaging their colleagues and playing the politics game and playing the how do I succeed at the expense of others game. And so we're not thrilled about work as a whole. And what's staggering to me about this data, this is Gallup data, is that this has been the same for 20 years. I mean, every year they release the data with this big fanfare, and it's like, oh, disengagement went down by 1%, from 52 to 51%. And we're all just okay with that. We're okay with the fact that most people spend 1/3 to 1/2 of their lives in an environment that they're not psyched about. And that's just the way the world is, I guess, right? So that's challenging. Now, as I mentioned, when you ask what's going on, when you ask the economists, when you ask people that are looking at the system as a whole, what is happening, they scratch their heads. But when you ask the people at the edge, they'll tell you. Bureaucracy is what's happening. What's happening is that the policies and structures and boundaries and processes and rules and norms by which we govern our behavior at work have metastasized into something that we're no longer fully in control of and that we no longer fully understand. And so it's slowing us down. It's creating friction. It's creating tension. It's creating dissatisfaction. And that dissatisfaction has a cost. It has a very real cost. So to give you an example, I like to talk about it in terms of organizational debt. So think about financial debt. You borrow money, you owe interest. That interest is a pain point for you until you pay it back. For those of you that work closely in software development, technical debt, you kind of rush to get the software out the door, and later on those choices have a cost. You have to work to refactor and reintegrate the code that you've created. Organizational debt is sort of a third concept, and I actually think the most pernicious. Organizational debt is all the rules and policies and structures we've created that are no longer serving us, but that we haven't refactored, that we haven't changed, that we haven't updated to reflect the present day. So there's sort of like something that maybe someone back in time understood why we did it that way, or maybe it once made sense, but it doesn't make sense anymore. Perfect example. So there's an auto parts, a brass foundry in France called Favi. And they are incredible at what they do. They're one of the only companies in that space that's been able to survive kind of the outsourcing boom. They're one of the only profitable, successful factories in that space in Europe. And when their prior CEO came to take over the job, he noticed as he walked the floor for the first time, someone standing by a cage of equipment with a slip of paper, just waiting. And he said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, well, I'm waiting for new gloves." Okay, and what's the paper all about? Well, when you need new gloves, you go to your manager, you show the boss your gloves that are no longer working, that are worn out, and they approve that they're no longer working, and then they give you a permission slip, and you leave your machine and you go over to this cage where all the gloves are under lock and key and all the equipment is under lock and key, and you turn in that permission slip and you wait while the person goes back and finds the right size and whatnot, and then they bring it back to you and stamp all your pages, and then you can go back to work with your gloves. And he had the CFO with him, and he said, "Hey, how much did the gloves cost us?" Well, they're about €5. And how much does it cost us for this man's machine to be down for 30 minutes? €5,000. Okay, so that's organizational debt. And the gloves were free the next day and from then on until the present day, right? So what happened there is somebody stole a pair of gloves. Somebody went into the storeroom and took all the gloves or took a piece of equipment, and a leader whose job it was in their head to ensure perfect execution and ensure compliance and safety and efficiency was like, I'm going to stop that from ever happening again. And the way I'm going to do it is by creating this elaborate process, right? But in fact, the process costs us more than just the trust and the judgment that would have gone into a much simpler system. So there's organizational debt everywhere. I've never met a team that's like, we don't have a stupid policy, we don't have a thing that's in our way or slowing us down from doing our best work. So it's something that does need to be addressed. Now, the reason that it exists and the reason that it's so hard to address is that we have a great confusion about the nature of organizations. So, an organization is a system. There are lots of systems in the world, and different systems have different natures. So when most leaders and executives that I meet around the world see these two words, they see them as synonyms. So they say, oh yes, complicated, complex, that means things that are frustrating and that I don't understand and that have lots of parts and that are very hard to kind of break down. And if, they're all the same, complicated, complex, I use those words interchangeably. But when you talk to a systems theorist, they say, no, there are very distinct kinds of systems in the world, and these are two of those options, and they have very distinct meanings. So I thought what we would do today is do like a rapid 60-second master's degree in systems theory by starting with the final, we might do one more quiz later, but nearly the final quiz. So by show of hands in the room, who thinks that a watch is a complicated system? Okay, who thinks it's a complex system? Okay, and what about the engine? Who thinks the engine is complicated? A couple people. And complex? A few more. Okay, let's turn the tables. What about weather? Who thinks weather is complicated? Okay, who thinks it's complex? And who's a conscientious objector who thinks I'm trying to trick you and you're not going to play? All right, and what about traffic? Traffic complicated? And traffic complex? Okay, cool. So you did what almost every audience in the world does, which is about half of you vote for one, about half of you vote for the other, and as we go further through the examples, fewer percentages of people play, but still roughly equally. So let's get to the bottom of this. So a watch and an engine are both what we would call complicated systems, and by that I mean that they are causal systems. There's a cause and effect relationship between their components. And while they might be rich with lots of components, there might be lots of pieces, and it might even require an expert to fix them, they are not going to surprise us. They are predictable. They are knowable. If you take your car into the mechanic on Friday and it's not working and they say it'll be ready on Monday, it probably will be. And it certainly won't surprise you with, a clown is not going to jump out of the engine when you pick it up, right? It's a known thing. It's a knowable thing. And so an expert can do that. When you have a problem in a complicated system, you can solve that problem. You can solve the problem. Then we have complex systems. Complex system is like weather or traffic or your immune system or a 6-year-old, things that we can't predict, right? That we have a sense, we call them dispositional systems. They have a vector, they have a way they're trending, right? It looks like it's probably going to rain today, but we can't be sure exactly how much and exactly where. Right? The only way to understand a complex system is to interact with it, to go outside, to be in it, to poke it, to see what happens when something occurs. And so you're always in dialogue, you're always in engagement with a complex system. The best way to identify one is if the thing you're looking at has a chance of surprising you, it's probably a complex system. If it's going to just come out of nowhere with a reaction you don't expect. And so with a complex system, problems are not solved, they are only managed. Right? Nobody ever comes in from the garden and says, honey, I fixed the garden. It's done. Right? That doesn't happen. You have to nurture it. You have to be, in relationship with the garden. And the same thing goes for a 6-year-old, right? You can try your damnedest to get that kid to go to the school of your choice. It might work, might not. So complex systems require that kind of interaction. So then the question becomes, well, what does that mean for organizations? So what do you think? What conclusions might you draw from your recent master's in systems theory? What's that? The organization is a complex. Yeah, the organization is a complex system. It's not a complicated one. There are complicated tasks and problems inside an organization. If I ship a FedEx envelope, there's a very high probability it's going to arrive the next day. But the culture, the way of working, the dynamics of the organization with 10 or 100 or 10,000 or 100,000 people working together is, of course, very complex, and most obviously because we human beings are complex. So you put a bunch of us together, that can only be more, right? And so if that's true, then that means that the way we engage with the organization when we think about culture and way of working and change has to be appropriate. It has to be fit to the context. So for example, when I talk to leaders who are quite frustrated because they've just gone through a culture change initiative where they wrote down all the values on posters and put the posters up, and people are still not behaving differently, I laugh because effectively they're shouting at the weather, right? They're just sort of like, yelling at a thing that doesn't respond to that. You can yell at the weather, you can yell at the garden all you like. That's not how things change in a complex system. The way things change in a complex system is you introduce something new, you put it into the wild, and then you see what happens. Maybe it's an attractor that creates a big reaction. Maybe you like that reaction, maybe you don't. But you're now interacting with that system. So we have to bring the right mindset and the right tool set to organizations if we want to change them, if we want to shape them, if we want to make them serve us better. And that doesn't matter who you are in the organization, that's true. So I like to say it this way: to manage complexity, we need a different operating system. We need a new OS. And I use the metaphor lightly, but I like the idea of just basically saying there's a foundational set of assumptions, of principles, of practices, of norms in every team, in every organization, that kind of upon which everything else happens, right? We assume what's true, and then the norms and the behavior of the organization is built on top of that. So my favorite example of an OS, of an assumption, is a conference room should have a table and chairs in it. Nobody questions that. That is just a given. Every office, every startup I've ever been to anywhere in the world, you go in the conference room, sure enough, table, chairs, right? Why? Because we assume we're going to be in this room to do something. What are we going to do? We're going to have a meeting. What's that require? Well, it's going to require sitting a lot. Why? Because it's going to last a long time. Okay, and what we need to, we're going to need a table for our laptops. Why? So we can be checking our email, because we can't let that go. And there's a whole sort of lattice work of assumptions there that build that OS. And then, of course, when you come into that room, you're limited. You've now constrained yourself. If I want to do something physical with us in this room and there's a table in the middle, if we want to use our bodies to think, if we want to use the walls and they're not set up that way, like suddenly we're limited in our capacity. So there's a limitation that comes with an OS. And this is a really good example. So to bring the idea of the OS to life, here are two different solutions to the same problem space. So the problem space is two roads are crossing. So we have a problem we have to solve for: how do we make sure they don't hit each other, and how do we maximize the throughput, the number of cars that get through the intersection per hour. And there's an OS on the left and a different one on the right. The OS on the left has a set of assumptions about people and the problem. What do you suppose are the assumptions about people and the problem in the lighted intersection with the red, yellow, green light? What's that? Yeah, sure. What else? People will do what they're told. Yeah. And more importantly, people need to be told that effectively, I don't really trust all y'all, and so we're going to have to keep this thing under lock and key. We're going to keep this thing moving based on a set of central instructions. And so we're going to use this apparatus. And by the way, because it's electronic and because it requires an algorithm and controls, it's quite a big apparatus. So we're going to have a central control station and people that program that, and we're going to need an electrical grid, and we're going to need to do a lot of things to make this intersection safe. And that is sort of the knock-on effect. And then what about this one? What are the assumptions of the roundabout about people and the problem? Got a few of these. What's that? Yeah, people are capable. Essentially, it's on you, right? The responsibility is with you, to each other and for each other, right? I'm going into the Coliseum with you, and I hope that we can all, coordinate, right? That we'll socially coordinate. And the way they do that is with a set of constraints, just two simple rules. We call them enabling constraints. One is go with the flow of traffic, so you got to go in the same direction as the circle, whatever that might be. And the second rule is that you have to give right away to the people in the circle. So they have the privilege, and you have to kind of work around them. Those are the only two rules in a roundabout, and if you follow those rules, you can handle an almost infinite number of scenarios of things that can happen. And to know how true that is, you only have to look at one of Europe's 8-lane roundabouts to see just how profound those simple rules can be when put into practice. So these are two different operating systems, two different sets of assumptions. The question that we now have to ask ourselves is, well, which one's safer? So on the whole, which one do you think is safer? Yeah, the roundabouts are about 85% safer, about 95% safer on fatality collisions. Which one's higher throughput? Roundabout, about 80 to 88% higher throughput per hour. Which one's cheaper to build and maintain? Roundabout, yep, 10 to 20 grand cheaper. which one works better when the power goes out? Humorous, right? Which one do we have 1,000 times more of? Yeah, and in fact, when I ask people, certainly stateside and sometimes here in Europe, which one do you feel more comfortable in? They're like, oh, well, I much prefer a light because I don't trust all these other people. I always feel uneasy and a roundabout, and I like to be able to, kind of relax. And when I pull up, I can check my phone, I can change the radio. I'm off the hook, essentially, right? The powers that be will tell me what to do, and I can be off the hook. This one requires quite a presence, right? It requires that you're there in the moment. It's on you. It's on all of us in coordination. So this is in most contexts, not every possible scenario on Earth, but in most contexts, the superior solution, but it asks more of us. It asks us to show up differently. And this one makes us feel like we're safe, but is actually less safe, right? So really, it's just two operating systems built on these ideas: control and compliance, and trust and autonomy, right? So we're making a choice. Now again, if we're complexity aware, if we're aware of all these different contexts, there are going to be situations and problems and products and moments where control and compliance approach, the red light, makes perfect sense. And God bless, that's wonderful. But there's a lot of situations where trust and autonomy make sense, but we haven't even considered it in a century, right? We haven't even gone back to say, wait a second, does an annual budget make sense in a world that changes this fast? Does telling someone what they should work on make sense in a world that's this varied, where their talents and skills are developing and moving and changing and shaping over time make sense? And what are the things that we're not really getting served by anymore? What's the org debt where we're like, is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to handle travel expenses than a travel freeze where everybody gets told they can't travel no matter what without manager approval? Is there a better way to solve that problem? Is there a roundabout solution? So a few organizations around the world that have taken a crack at that have sort of flipped the table over on bureaucracy and played with it a bit. Handelsbanken, which is based in Sweden, in Stockholm, is a bank that in the 70s was sort of in trouble coming out of a financial crisis. And the new CEO was asked to really change things up. And he came in and said, hey, I think we've got this backwards. We at HQ are telling all these branches what to do, but they know the customers, they're at the edge, they're in community, they're the ones that have all the information. Maybe we should change that up. And so his headline was, the branch is the bank. And hundreds of branches were suddenly given the authority to say, hey, make loans to who you want to make loans to at rates you want to make them at. Do service for your customers the way you need to do it. They're not going to have a central service line where some person reading off a script is going to handle your customers. You guys can figure it out. And to keep things on the straight and narrow, we'll just pick a couple metrics that are learning metrics for us that matter, and that'll be the thing that we use to know if we're on the right track. So we'll measure profit over revenue, back to ROA. So we'll measure, is it actually working as a system? And we'll measure customer satisfaction. And we'll measure that branch to branch and then as a system as a whole. So the branches will see transparently every month how profit over revenue and customer satisfaction is trending. And then we'll see as a system as a whole how we're doing versus the aggregate industry. And in order to sort of fix the incentives problem in the financial industry, we won't have these big individual bonuses and these incentives to sell, or create 15 different accounts for a customer that doesn't need one. Instead, what we'll do is we'll just track profit over revenue for the entire category here in Europe. And if we're better than the average, then everybody gets, a bonus to their pension. And if we're not better than the average, then we just roll right into the next year and everyone's paid fairly, and that's fine. And so we're all winning together and losing together, right? And so they went and made this play. And for 40 years, for 40 straight years, they've beaten the average of all the people in their competitive set on profit over revenue and customer satisfaction. And they've actually gone so far as to sort of blow up their annual budgeting process and move to something that's more dynamic, that's more local, that's more regional. Because again, as long as you're tracking profit over revenue and customer satisfaction, what difference does the plan make? What matters is, are we performing this week, this month, this quarter, this year? Through every financial crisis that we've had, the big ones that have really shaken the system, they've been able to just very resiliently skate over that because they don't make stupid loans. Why? Because no one's incentivized to. Or Morningstar Tomatoes, which is an American tomato processing company. It's actually the world's largest. So if you've had some ketchup lately, you might have had something to do with them. their founder decided that it was already a tough enough industry as it was, and so to make it more vibrant and more interesting, we would let all the employees write their own job descriptions and set their own salaries. And when I say that, people are like, but of course, they've done it for 20 years. So this is a company where their category average profitability is about 2%. Their average over the last 20 years is 20%. So they're a 10x outperformer where people are writing their own job descriptions and set their own salaries. How do they do it? They do it with an advice process. So every year I sit down, I write what I think I want to do this year and who I want to do it with and make an agreement with my colleagues, and then they react to that. They give me advice. This is overshooting, this is undershooting, you're really good at this, I can't wait to work with you on that. This is something that I think you should consider. And people edit their take because they know they're going to be working with these peers. They're in relationship with these peers. So there's a social pressure instead of a top-down pressure. And the same thing goes for comp. So they have these elected compensation groups in every pocket of the business. And when people propose their salary, they're doing it with total transparency about the firm's profitability, the category averages, what their colleagues get paid, and for what. And they're saying, all right, well, this is what I think is fair. Then they get advice, and then they modify their take based on that. And again, this is all judgment-based. It's trust-based. So if they say, I think I'm worth $20 an hour, and everybody else is worth $15, the system's going to let them play that out. And they're going to find out what are the reputational consequences of that? What are the social consequences of that? What are the P&L consequences of that? That's going to be found out. And if somebody does something so aggressive in a system like this that it can't be tolerated, there's a conflict process that someone can engage where they'll have some mediation and some discussion, and they can use their judgment and their adult communication to try to find a way forward. And that's something that they very rarely need. So that's something that's going on at Morningstar. For those of you that have read the book Turn the Ship Around, I'm a big fan of David's work on the USS Santa Fe, where he inherited the worst performing ship in the Navy, essentially, a nuclear sub that was not doing well, was told he could not change the staff of that sub, had to actually keep them exactly as they are, but needed to turn the ship around. And he did this through a series of adjustments that increased transparency and increased clarity about what competency looked like, but most importantly, increased empowerment. So people would come to him and say, Captain, what are my orders? And he would say, well, what do you intend to do? And he'd say, I have no idea. No one's ever asked me that before. He's like, well, come back when you know what you intend to do. And over time, people realize we have to show up ready. We have to show up prepared for our role to captain because he's not going to tell us. So they'd come and say, I thought about it and I want to go 45 degrees north and dock and refuel and do this training exercise and then go back out to sea. And he'd say, very well. Sounds good. Let's do it. He reserved one choice for himself. That was the choice to fire a nuclear weapon. That he was going to keep for himself, just out of pure responsibility. But everything else was distributed to the system. 2 years later, it was the highest performing ship, produced more officers than any other ship in naval history. It's a great story. I highly recommend you take a look at it. And then last but not least, Hire's a Chinese appliance manufacturer that has done some really interesting things in the past few years. Their CEO started to recognize that they were getting further and further removed from customer. And that was because of functionalization. So you have HR over here and design over here and marketing over here, and everybody's trying to communicate, but they can't because we're in silos, and the end customer is not hearing or seeing that value. And so what they did is they took a 60,000 person company and they blew it up into 2,000 autonomous teams. Each team had a product or a service, internal or external, that they were responsible for, and each team had a customer. And it was end to end. It was P&L level responsibility. So it's make or break. You decide when it sinks or swims. If you fold up your tent on a product that you're trying to make happen, that doesn't mean you're fired. You just move in the marketplace to another system. You start a new innovation project or you join another existing team that's scaling. So there's a kind of a career pathing and a role mix ecology inside the system that's quite powerful. And this has been so remarkably successful that in the past few years, they've gone from 60,000 to almost double that number of employees. They've become the world's fastest growing appliance manufacturer. And they actually acquired GE Appliances in the midst of all this and implemented their model there. And for the first time in a decade, that business posted a profit and a revenue growth. So there's a real power to this connection to customer and this new structure that focuses on functional integration and speed and connection rather than, how do we centralize things to make them more efficient, right? Because it would be so much more efficient if we put all the lawyers together and got rid of half of them. Well, yes, that would be efficient for the P&L right now in this moment, but would it be more efficient for our overall outcomes, for our success as a system, right? So it's really about pulling on those different tensions. So at the end, in the book, I looked at about 68 different companies out of a group of over 300 that we could consider. And there were really only two mindsets that sort of permeated these places. And some of them were sort of living them to the fullest. Some of them were experimenting with them. It depends on the company. But these were the two ideas. One was that they were generally people positive, meaning they sort of took the roundabout take on how do we feel about people and risk. And the idea was people are worthy of trust and respect. People are capable of using judgment. People are capable of growing and learning themselves if left to their own devices in the right environment. And that we ultimately seek autonomy, mastery, and purpose, as self-determination theory and Dan Pink would say. Those are the things that really unlock our motivation, not some end-of-year bonus scheme that's going to sort of mess with our wiring. And then complexity conscious, which you all now have a master's in, was really just about the idea that they recognized that the market was full of different contexts, that the organization was full of different contexts, and that we needed the right approach for the job. So if we're dealing with something that's uncertain, that's going to surprise us, we need to have the right constraints, we need to allow for emergence, we need to test and learn. All the values of agility and lean and those sorts of things that we hear bouncing around the industry are all sort of rooted in this basic idea that if it's unknown, then we need ways of knowing and finding out. We need ways of doing this dynamically. We don't want to make big commitments to a 3-year plan or a budget that's going on forever or a set of choices that are going to come back to bite us. We want to actually learn more and steer continuously. And that's the big idea there. One of the founders of sociocracy, which is one of the sort of early distributed authority systems based in the Netherlands, used to talk about a bicycle as an example. He would say, if I told you to ride from point A to point B on a bicycle, and I locked the handlebars, if I screwed them down tight, you would fall down in 3 seconds. Like you cannot ride a bike when the wheel doesn't turn. And I invite you to try it with proper padding. But it just, you immediately fall over. What you actually do when you ride from point A to point B is you keep your eye on B, and as you overshoot left, you correct right. And as you overshoot right, you correct left. And you're doing this in micro adjustments all the time. When you're riding, you're not even aware of it. You're unconsciously micro-adjusting, always heading towards intent, always heading towards purpose. And that should be the design of the organization. That should be the design of any organism that's trying to achieve its intent, is that it's continuously steering, that it's continuously adjusting towards its collective and stated intent, rather than saying, all right, let's lock these at 17 degrees and pray, and we'll check again in January. So everybody says, great, that's lovely, Aaron, let's change. But here's the problem. Change is impossible and change sucks. So even though we're all excited about this, we can't do anything about it. That's because we view change as something that looks like this. It is essentially the mourning process. Change is a death to us in our culture. And so we have, this, I don't want to do it, and then we're forced to do it, and then we trip and fall, and it's miserable, and then some of us have this moment of epiphany, and then we crawl back up, and we're 5% better off than we were when we started, which to me seems like a horrible way to do it. And of course, if you can afford a very fancy, exotic consulting company, then it looks like this. And so now you have the exact same thing, but with more bullet points, and it's in 3D. And again, like if this is your vision of change, of course you're going to find yourself frustrated, because what does a system of progressive steps, of linear steps of change assume about the nature of the system itself? That it's complicated, right? It's treating it as a watch. We're all in the discover phase, and then we're all in the visualize phase. We're going to do a survey of what's broken, and then we'll tell you the most important things. Oh, there's a lack of trust at XYZ company. Well, that was the average take. But if Bezos walks into a bar, the average net worth is $100 million. But that's not true. That's not what's really going on in the bar. What's really going on in the bar is there's a rich guy and a bunch of poor people. So we have to recognize that when we start to talk about averages, when we talk about us all being in the same stage, that we're doing change like the organization is a watch, we're going to find ourselves frustrated. And so what we do instead is we change how we change to a different model. And that model looks more like this. It is teaching teams at every level, at every shape, I don't care whether you're flat or hierarchical or whatever you are, to do this looping process. And this looping process is about taking back ownership of our way of working. It's about saying the way we work as teams is something that we care about, that we think about, that we nurture. It is our second job. Our first job is to do what we do. Our second job is to be org designers and to shape the way we do it, and that's always going on. So it starts with identifying, well, what are the tensions you hold? And the question I always ask teams when I start out with them is, what's stopping you from doing the best work of your life? That's the bar for me. What's stopping you from doing the best work of your life? Because if you're not doing it, life is short. Like, what are we doing here? And so then they'll say, oh, we have meetings to prepare for meetings, Aaron, and it's nonsense. Or we have way too many emails. Or we have a lack of trust. Or we can't make decisions quickly. Or my boss talks nonstop and I never get a word in edgewise. Or we're not diverse enough. Or fill in the blank, right? There are hundreds of things that you can hear. They're all fine. Whatever's true for the team is true for the team. And instead of saying, what's the tension for the org, which is not a real thing, we say, what are the tensions for the teams inside the org? What is true? And if there are things that are present as patterns, then that's cool to find out. But let's find that out by talking to the system. Routinely, so I have these tension and practice cards with tensions on them. Routinely, I will get a leadership team of 40 or 50 top execs in a room, and I will have them choose the tensions that they think are most present for the organization. The top 5, let's say, out of a list of 78. But I'll do it in 3 groups. And then I'll have them come together and share what each of the 3 groups at the very top of the house thought was going on. And they are routinely wildly different. And that is the moment when I can say, yeah, there's no one true thing going on here. You're right and you're right. But now what are you going to do about it? So we find our tensions. We pick the ones that are most present and alive for us. Then we explore practices. What are alternative ways of solving this problem? What are the roundabout solutions? Maybe we invent some, maybe we borrow some, maybe we go on a field trip and talk to some of these other organizations and see what they've learned. But the idea is we got to go figure it out for ourselves. And then finally, let's design an experiment. So let's say we decide to try something different. Maybe one of our problems is that we don't do a good job of hearing everyone's voice, right? And we've learned from a project that was done in-house here that equal talk time is one of the best predictors of team success. And so we're going to start meetings with a check-in where we just hear everyone's voice. What's a question we can all answer that'll get us present in the room? Really small experiment. But then we have to decide who's going to do it and for how long and how will we know if it helped. So a very tightly defined, constrained, safe-to-try experiment that moves us from here to what Stephen Johnson calls the adjacent possible. What's right next door that we can actually get to. Because if I come in on day 1 and I'm like, let's blow up the budgeting process, everybody's like, no. That's not going to work. This place will be pandemonium. But we could get there if we take some steps that start to move the momentum and start to trigger bigger questions in our heads. So I started with one leader at an educational company where the first question in their head was, how do we make decisions better and faster? Super exciting, but also easy to get at. It wasn't until month 12 that they started asking, like, what should we do about resource allocation? Because it seems awful slow that we're making these decisions once a year. And we were sort of like, oh, interesting question. You know, once the question's there, there's space for the answer, right? Then once you have that negative space in your head, or the leader has that negative space in their head, they're going to go on the hunt to find the answer. So designing the experiment, then we do it, and then 8 weeks later we get together and we hold a little retrospective. Did that help? Did it hurt? Is it the same? Is it different? What's going on? When we teach teams to do this concurrently, and we have experiments alive in the system about the way we work, the things that start to work spread. So a team figures something out that really serves them, they tell other teams about it, and if we created a system of trust and autonomy where things can spread, where we're allowed to choose our way of working, then suddenly we find that more and more teams are doing it that way. And there may even be moments where the leadership or the people at the edge or whoever start to make bigger pronouncements, like we're going to do things this way, or we're going to take what those teams have figured out and try to scale it. So this is the model of continuous participatory change that we're finding has the most legs in these systems. A few quick rules of thumb or heuristics or principles that we figured out along the way that help while you're doing this process. The first is through them, not to them. So again, this has to be happening in the system, in relationship with participation. This is not a PowerPoint document that's written over the weekend and foisted upon 10,000 people, right? That is not change. It's not changing how we change. The second is learn by doing. So I am so sick of having debates with people about what's the right way to make decisions, or the right way to have a meeting, or the right way to talk to somebody, or the right way to give feedback. Just try something new and then decide. Did it help? Did it hurt? Just do it, right? This is my son riding a balance bike. Riding a training wheels bike is not learning to ride a bike. That is learning to be in a spin class. Learning how to ride a bike is balance. It is being in relationship to the bike. So learn by doing rather than by arguing, right? We're not going to argue our way to an answer about what our operating system should be. Start small. Big systems are so addicted to scale because to have a idea that moves $1 billion system 1%, it has to be a $10 million idea. But instead, we know that systems change through the progressive pattern of small things that spark revolution. So we actually want to, instead of trying to move this boulder, we want to figure out how do we do this with 1 team, with 2 teams, with 10 teams, with 1 location. I did 1 factory last year, right? Just figure it out here and then let the echo effect start to unfold. Start by stopping. So this is a really good one in the age of Marie Kondo and tidying up, right? We all are really good at accumulating. This is a real client calendar. 45 hours a week of meetings on average for this exec team. 45 hours a week, no time for lunch. So instead of trying to fix that by adding more stuff to it, let's add another smart meeting, let's add an agile practice, let's add. We said, let's stop. Let's stop meeting for 2 weeks and see what hurts. What do you miss when we stop? And we do that, we learn things that we couldn't ever have the space to learn, right? So we want to actually take the time and make the space. Take 90 minutes at the end of the week to reflect on the way we work. Stop a policy that doesn't make sense. You don't have to have the solution. Someone's like, well, if we get rid of our travel policy, what will we do without a travel policy? I don't know, let's see what happens. What if we just didn't have one? Would it be worse? Would it be better? Would we learn something? Would someone else propose something that we wouldn't have thought of as the leader? Sometimes it's okay to just let the negative space create a pull on our system. And then finally, join the resistance. So it's very easy in change work to argue that the person that's not playing is a resistor, that they're a laggard, that they don't get it, that they need to get on or off the bus. And instead, if you engage those people in curiosity, not to convince them, but just to ask, why isn't this working for you? Why aren't you engaged in this? Why wouldn't you try this new thing? What about this is not appealing to you? They'll tell you stuff you need to hear. The incentive system is not set up for them, and they have 2 kids in private school. They don't have time on their calendar to show up to this thing because they have 3 bosses that they dotted line to, and they are back-to-back packed. There's a reason. People are rational for the most part, and they will tell you what's going on. And then you can say, all right, well, let's design our way out of that. So is there something that we could co-create that would make this more accessible for you? Or you can just take that and thank them for the gift of the feedback, of the clarity about what's really going on. So I'll leave you with this. The high jump was done this way in the late 60s, early 60s, late 60s. And for those of the men in the room, you can see how precarious this is. And this was the norm because the other side of the bar was for a long time just dirt. So you had to land on your feet. And this was the way to do it. But then, towards the latter half of the 60s, that dirt became foam, it became padded, other options became possible. Dick Fosbury came along and obviously went over backwards and head first, which is now quite a famous story and not one that I intend to bore you with. But what's fascinating about Dick's story is that after he won the gold medal in the 68 Olympics, the reaction from the fellow competitors was, works for Dick but won't work for us, right? It's great for him, he's a freak, but we have these reasons that we can't do that, right? That it won't work for us. And over time, those reasons got whittled away, and now, of course, only one person has held the world record jumping any way different than this for the last 50 years, right? So what we know is that people are going to have that reaction. Oh, works for Bert Sorg won't work for us. Works for Morningstar won't work for us. Works for Google won't work for us. That's not really a great excuse. The way to find out what will work for you is to jump. It's uncomfortable, it's a little nerve-wracking, it feels weird, but the reality is it's pretty safe to try. And if you constrain where you do it, how you do it, and you make sure that the people that are doing it are using their judgment, that they're in the roundabout, then a lot of things are possible that we're not seeing today. And we just might be able to unlock our potential and solve some of the quite intractable problems that we face. We have climate issues, we have political issues, we have issues in for-profit and nonprofit businesses that are going to require a different level of performance. And we're not going to be able to get that with what got us here. So it's really incumbent that we kind of take the leap. And that's why I'm so excited that you all came to hear this message today. So thank you so much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask?
I just wondered, what's been your experience of working with the executives and getting them all excited about an idea, what then happens after that? Like, do you continue to hold their hands, or do they go away and implement, or do they go away and it sort of falls by the wayside?
Yeah. So what we have found is most helpful is to have at least some coaching support both internally and externally. So when we get started, we'll start by having kind of a red pill, blue pill moment to see, like, do we want to go deeper into the rabbit hole? And if we have that alignment and we have the right mindset, then we might provide a couple coaches into the system to kind of be present and help the teams that are looping kind of stay honest to the loop and stay honest to themselves. And then we'll also find people internally who are very excited about this stuff and maybe have been trying to agitate this themselves, and we'll kind of start to bring them into the fold as coaches as well, so that as practices bubble up and we realize, oh, this is a way of meeting that really works here, this is a way of sharing that really works here, this is a tool that we're getting excited about, they can become kind of knighted in those things, and that way when we're not needed, which is hopefully soon, then there's still a support structure in place. One of the things that's not often talked about is most of the cases in the book have a set of internal people who are coaches with no authority, who exist purely to serve teams at the edge. So, in Buurtzorg, I think there are 14,000 nurses now out in their distributed system, and there are 50 people in corporate, and of those, like 15 are coaches. So if a team throws up a distress signal like our numbers aren't looking good, or our engagement isn't good, or we're not feeling right, or something's off, they can request a coach come in, and the coach labs in with all that systemic knowledge and just tries to help. But again, they have no authority to tell that team what to do. So there's an ecology like that in most of these systems that we see in some way, shape, or form.
Are there one or two examples which come up again and again? I mean, I know, for example, at Google, we have, with our corporate credit cards, anything under $20, you don't need a receipt for.
Right.
And that's a really good example where we are trusted.
Totally.
And that just eases it through the system. Do you find examples similar or other where it comes up again and again in large corporations?
Yeah, well, I think to your point, the thing that comes up again and again is the concept of what W. L. Gore calls a waterline. So the waterline is when you're sailing a boat, if you get a hole below the waterline, everybody dies. But if you get a hole above the waterline, you can patch it when you get back to shore. And so what they taught their people very early on is when you're making a decision, any decision, we trust you, and think long and hard about, is this decision above or below the waterline? If it's above the waterline, knock yourself out. And so for different companies, that's at different levels, right? My company can only risk so much. A bigger company might be able to risk more. But we know where our waterline is. And then if it's below the waterline, seek advice. So go to people that have done it before, go to people that will be affected by it, and seek advice before you make that decision. And then for those very few decisions that are really critical, maybe it's an integrative decision. So it means that multiple roles have to consent to that before they act on it. So for example, we can't change the maternity and paternity policy at my company without multiple roles consenting. But someone can spend $10,000 with advice, and someone can spend $1,000 whenever they want. Right? So there are different levels of clarity. And then when you see decisions being made that don't align with maybe what you would do, there's a question to ask. A, is it safe to try? So is the learning that will occur worth the squeeze? Because again, if we just protect everybody from learning, then we end up immobilized. We end up with these very incapable teams, right? It's sort of like raising a kid where you don't let them skin their knee. They'll never be good runners. You have to let people learn and bump up against reality, but you want to do that in a safe to try way. So you want to find, like, where's that dynamic, where's that edge? So that kind of decision stack, as I call it, is present in almost every case, and there are different languages for it, but it's always about what's the waterline, what's the advice process, what are those decisions that we reserve for certain roles or for integrative groups to make together, and how do we push as much as possible above the waterline? Because obviously the more we have there, the more adaptive and the more resilient we are.
To extend the metaphor about above the line and below the line, it sounds like there's a presupposed assumption everyone agrees where that line is.
Correct.
And
yeah.
It also assumes that everything is net positive, and there is nobody that will lose as a result of the change.
Sure.
So how do you navigate situations where there's perceived headcount losses or perceived political influence losses that one person will lose if you make the change to the system?
Yeah, great question. So a couple things. One, it's very true that the waterline is in different places for different people. So based on their own comfort, their own experience, the roles that they hold. I mean, certainly as the founder of my company, I feel like my waterline is higher than other people just because I'm like, I don't know, I just feel a sense of ownership that I can do more than maybe someone else does. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't allow them to do the same thing, but they may not allow themselves, right? So their waterline is where it is. So I think that's absolutely true. Part of developing a system with this kind of maturity is having that dialogue. So the value of the advice process is, if you're even not sure, just engage some advice, because you'll become a richer decision maker and we'll all benefit from understanding your situation. So there's a little bit of extra work that goes into it early on while we build that competency and that mastery. And then over time, we get better and better at kind of refining where that line is. And also as the situation changes, So like at the beginning of this year, my company changed the nature of our incorporation. And to do that, we had to kind of dump cash and then re-add it. There was a month where we didn't have a lot of money in the bank. And it was like, hey, everybody, flag, the waterline just moved, right? So now we all need to be aware of that. And then once it recovers, we can kind of go back to our normal attenuation. So that's the first answer. The second question was about when someone loses, what does that look like? And there are two kinds of losing. So there's legitimate, losses of power or influence or control, and then there are perceived ones. And I think one of the big shifts that happens in these types of organizations is changing one kind of control for another, one kind of identity for another. So as a leader, yeah, maybe I don't have the same number of head count underneath me. Does that actually make me lesser? Is a debate worth having, and the identity of who I am in the system and how I add value and what I'm worth may or may not change based on that. So there's a little bit of growing up that has to happen about what's really being lost here. But the other thing is, when there are real losses, when someone's going to lose their job, or a bunch of people are, or we're going to change something that materially affects what we're doing, that's probably an integrative decision. So we're going to get consent from multiple roles that we've entrusted to hold that type of decision. And even though not everyone will agree with that decision, we've agreed with who will make it. So it's possible that we can make a decision tomorrow at the ready that eliminates an entire section of our business. The people that are in that section of the business have consented to the body that would make that decision making it. So it's something that we're more explicit about, like where do decision rights live and who do we trust. And a lot of the roles that hold that kind of power in systems like this are elected. So in Hire, at the Ready, in other companies, often the people that hold those levels of influence are elected so that they can be trusted to do what's best for the system or the collective as a whole. And for sure, sometimes what's best for the collective is not best for the individual. And there's some real tension and stress there.
I've got a question about the sort of transparency of remuneration.
Yeah.
You mentioned, in one or two of the companies that everybody knew what everybody else was getting paid.
Yeah.
Is that an obstacle too far? It feels like a really strange thing. I know in Sweden they publish their salaries and everybody knows what everyone's getting paid.
Yeah.
But how divisive is it not to know what everybody's getting paid?
So there's a few things about it that are interesting. One is that in most cultures, the opacity of pay leads to bias and unfairness in comp. So just on the whole, it means that people that are less vocal or less negotiative or have a different background or situation might end up not being paid as well as their counterparts. And there's just a lot of data to suggest that. So one of the things it does is create more fairness or more equity over time. But I think the more interesting thing is that when we don't know what people are being paid, we're missing out on a huge part of the economic equation of the business. So if we're meant to be leaders and managers and people that are shaping the decisions we make, and we don't know what those decisions cost, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. And so in terms of developing that entrepreneurial spirit and that awareness, it's a big gap. And so I think there are a lot of cultures where it's quite a sensitive topic, where it's quite an emotional topic. But what we've learned through practice, and we did first transparent pay at the Ready and then self-set pay in 2 progressive years. And what we've learned is that it's the transition that's painful. Once you're on the other side and you're really embedded there, then there's a different kind of discussion. But it's actually the transfer from one thing to another that's the most dangerous. So I sort of invite people to be cautious about that rather than where they're going. The how you do it almost matters more than the doing it itself. But yeah, on the whole, I think I definitely come down on the side of the benefits outweigh the costs. But there are stresses and tensions and costs and outbursts and people who realize unbelievable inequity has been occurring and other people who don't understand why there's a difference. But again, I think that's building the capacity. So if someone comes to me and is like, Aaron, I'm paid half what this other person is paid, and I think that's totally unfair. now we have a chance to understand something. Either they're right or we're right. So if they're right, we'll find out through dialogue that maybe it is a little bit unfair and we can make an adjustment, or they can if it's a self-set pay environment. And if we're right, they're going to learn something about what the company values. So maybe they haven't sold anything and this other person has sold $2 million of services. That's why they get paid twice as much. And now they realize, oh, this place values sales. But they didn't know that before. It was just sort of in the soup of how the important people judge the other people, right? So I think just the transparency creates those conversations.
With that, please join me in a massive round of applause for Aaron Dignan.
Thank you.